Lord, we thank you for our time this evening. Just thank you for your word. Thank you that we're able to gather together to hear it, to read it, to study it. Lord, and we just believe that you delight to speak through the text of the Scriptures, Lord, and so we just want to give you that opportunity tonight. Lord, I pray that all that is said, all that is shared tonight, Lord, whether from me or from anyone else, Lord, would just, as it says in that verse, and I think it's 1 Peter, let the one who speaks speak as the oracles of God. Lord, that's our desire tonight, is just to hear from you through the Scriptures and through our fellowship. So we just give you this time and trust, Lord, that you're going to be among us. In Jesus' name, amen. So last time we were in Daniel chapter 6. Somebody want to briefly tell us what happened in Daniel chapter 6?
Rachel?
You probably remember a felt board illustration of this from your childhood.
Daniel thrown the lion's den.
Daniel and the lion's den. Very good. And it's very important that we remember that, because this next section has absolutely nothing to do with Daniel and the lion's den. It takes place a few decades earlier, and I put together a timeline, and I meant to print it up, but I forgot. So I'll email one out to everybody so you can, when you all go back and review these videos, like I know you do, you'll have that timeline to reference. But we'll see in Daniel 7 verse 1, this takes place in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, which, if you remember from Belshazzar, who was Belshazzar? The grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, who was a king of
Babylon.
But who was king when Daniel was thrown in the lion's den?
Darius.
Who was king of?
Darius the Persian.
Exactly, Darius the Mede. And so the Medes and the Persians had already conquered the Babylonians, and so but this is kind of like shoots back to the beginning of Belshazzar's reign. If I had my timeline here, you'd all be able to see very clearly. Here's where Belshazzar takes over. Here's where Darius conquers, and then this is the first year of Belshazzar's reign. So just a couple other things that we had talked about previously. Way back in week 1, before chapter 1, in our kind of introductory chapter, where we were making a point about the language that Daniel was written in and the significance of that. Who remembers what was significant about the language that Daniel was written in?
I want to say like the common Greek. Some of it, like the vernacular.
It was the common vernacular. It was not Greek, but Aramaic.
Okay.
The New Testament's written in Greek a few hundred years later. Once we'll see the story as it unfolds, the Greeks will eventually conquer the whole world, and that's why everybody spoke Greek in the New Testament's day. But in Daniel's day, Aramaic was it was closer to a universal language than would have been Hebrew. Now, chapter 1 of Daniel is in Hebrew, just like the rest of the Old Testament. Then chapters 2 through 7 are in Aramaic. And so what we're looking at tonight is really the last chapter of the Aramaic section. And then starting in chapter 8 through the rest of the book is in Hebrew. What do we say was the significance of Daniel writing this book in the common vernacular as opposed to Hebrew, which the rest of the Old Testament's written in? Anybody remember?
I mean, just who the audience is, kind of like who is Daniel speaking to. If it's written in the Aramaic, then it's probably the audience is probably intended for the whole population, the whole world, maybe, I guess you would say, the known world at the time. If it's written in Hebrew, it's kind of directed to the nation of Israel.
Very good. And so the parts that are in Aramaic, we can kind of understand that Daniel's writing these not just to his kinsmen, the nation of Israel, but it's more a universal message. And when we look at the content of what we've seen, it has a lot to do with Gentile kings and rulers. If you remember from chapter 2, the statue, we have the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. Like, these are all of the Gentile powers that conquer the world. And so all of this takes place, just like in chapter 1, when Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem. and we referred to it like from the book of Luke 21. He says the time of the Gentiles. So like Daniel is kind of sharing with us these prophecies that are from the time of the Gentiles, and that's pretty much been the theme of what we've seen so far. And if you had to summarize the message that God is giving to these Gentile kings, primarily to Nebuchadnezzar we've seen, but also kind of to Belshazzar, also to Darius, what's the message that the Lord has been wanting to say to these Gentile kings? Somebody just summarize it for us.
He's the God of gods and the ruler over heaven and earth.
He is God of gods. He is God the Most High. And he raises up kings and he casts them down. So it's like Nebuchadnezzar, God humbles him. Belshazzar, God, once he brings out God's holy things, he conquers him that night. Darius, he allows his leadership to basically exalt him as God, and God brings him down. Basically, with Darius, he loved Daniel, and God rescued Daniel from the lion's den, and it caused Darius to say, "Surely your God is God of gods." And so that was kind of the message he's been giving to each of the Gentile kings. And when we look at if we were to just make an outline of Daniel, there's really two ways that people tend to divide Daniel up. In one way, there's the chapters 1 through 6, and then chapters 7 through 12. And if you look at just chapters 1 through 6, they would call that the historical section. Like this is the history, and then chapters 7 through 12 would be the prophetic section. This is the prophecy. So it would be like first half history, second half prophecy. That's one way that Daniel's generally divided up. I'm of the view that that's not exactly the way Daniel was trying to divide it up, especially considering the two different languages that it's written in. What it seems to me, what Daniel's wanting the way that Daniel divides it up is chapters 2 through 7, which is the sections that are in Aramaic, which are it's kind of a section all unto itself, which is kind of the word to the Gentiles, and then chapters 1 and then 8 through 12, which is in Hebrew, which would be the word to his fellow Israelites. And so looking at it from that perspective, what chapter 7 is really the conclusion of that section. 2 through 7 is kind of the Aramaic section. Like this is the message to the Gentiles, and it's kind of the conclusion of that section. One way that it's, let me just, again, I should have printed it up for you, but I didn't. When we look at chapters 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, they kind of are, they establish what's called a chiasm, or a chiastic structure. Has anybody ever heard that term other than Carl? Carl's not here. So in English, we normally speak in parallelism, which would mean we go A, B, A, B. And like, so Dave went to the store, James went to the house. So A, like person, B, where'd he go? A, B. Other languages, especially biblical Hebrew, biblical Greek, often work A, B, B, A. They kind of go out and they come back in. We do that a little bit in English, sometimes in poetry, like with my eye, I see, and hear with my ear, A, B, B, A. But that's called a chiastic structure. It kind of goes out and it comes back in. When you look at the Aramaic section of Daniel, chapter 2, the prophetic vision of the nations given to Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Hebrews are delivered from death. Chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is judged and humbled. Chapter 5, Belshazzar is judged and humbled. Chapter 6, Daniel, the other Hebrew, is rescued from a perilous situation. Chapter 7, a vision of the Gentile world powers. So it's like 2 and 7 go together, 3 and 6 go together, and 4 and 5 go together. So it kind of goes A, B, C, and then comes back C, B, A. And so all that to just say, when we're looking at chapter 7, there's a connection that we'll see between the vision of chapter 7 and the vision of chapter 2. They rhyme kind of similarly to how Daniel in the lion's den and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. They're a similar concept of a story. Those two are similar. Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar's judgments are similar. The visions are similar. So when we're looking at this vision of that Daniel gets, that's in the first year of the reign of Belshazzar, like, it's kind of weird to us. You'd think you'd put it in chronological order. Like if an American or a Westerner was to write it, he would have said, Belshazzar, his reign, here's the vision, here's he dies, Darius takes over. But that's not how Daniel organized it. He had it in kind of this chiasm because he wanted to kind of draw a parallel between these two. So even though it's kind of a weirdly out of chronological order, when we read this chapter 7, we're going to see, wow, this is kind of telling a very similar story to what God showed to Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 2. So just keep that in mind as we read through this together. We're probably, like happened with chapter 2, we're probably not going to get through the whole thing tonight because there's a lot to it. And this is even longer of a chapter than chapter 2 was. But if you remember the kind of layout of the various kingdoms and who's taking over the Gentile world, we're going to see something very similar in chapter 7. And then in chapter 2, it ended with the stone destroying the mountain. We're going to see a similar ending with God the Most High, the Ancient of Days, conquering the Gentile powers. So all that to say, let's go ahead and jump in to Daniel chapter 7. Lord willing, I would like to first read let's see. Yeah, let's just read 1 through verse 6, and then we're going to... No. Sorry, before we read, I'm going to do one more little outline illustration. So, sorry, I know this is a lot. It's more than I expected, but... Daniel 7, we want to look at an outline of Daniel 7 briefly. There's really... two main sections. There's the dream that Daniel has. We're going to see that. That's basically verse 1 through verse 14. And then there's the interpretation that's given. That's 15 through 27. And so he has the dream and then he gives the interpretation. The dream is divided into 3 visions. If you look in verse 2, Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold. He says that, I saw in my vision 3 times. So in verse 1, it says that he had a dream and visions of his head. You notice that dream is singular, but visions are plural. So there's one dream, but there's multiple visions. And Daniel divides the visions out by when he says, I had a vision. So if you notice in verse 1, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night. And so that's like, I'm telling the first vision. And then if you skip down to verse 7, after this, I saw in the night visions. Now he's telling the second vision. You skip down to verse 15. Skip down to verse 13. I saw in the night visions. So he does that 3 times. So he's like, I had a dream, visions, plural, in my head. So we're going to look at the way that that this dream is outlined is in 3 separate visions. The first one, 2 through 6. The second one, 7 through 12. The third one, 13 through 14. Everybody tracking with me? I know we went through that fast. 1 dream, 3 visions. So let's go ahead and read the first vision of the 3. And that's in verse 1 through 6. For time, I'll go ahead and just read it. Daniel 7, verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth, between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. So we're going to pause right there. Somebody real quick summarize for us that first vision. What did he see?
We saw 4 beasts.
Mm-hmm.
Describes 3 of them as being like a lion, a bear, and a leopard.
Yep, very good. So he sees 4 coming out of the sea, but like Dave mentioned, he only describes 3 of them. The first like a lion, the second like a bear, the third like a leopard. Then he kind of, and starting in verse 7, after this I saw in the night visions. So he's telling his second vision. Starting in verse 7, I'll just go ahead and read through verse 12. After this I saw in the night visions. And behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, 3 came up among them, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then, because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking, and as I looked, the beast was killed, its body destroyed, and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So that's the second vision. Somebody briefly summarize what we saw in the second vision.
That description, though, of this is not a summary, but the description of that the Ancient of Days here sounds a lot like the description in Revelation 7 or Revelation chapter 1.
Yeah, with the hair like wool and the fire. Yeah. So what did he see? The first vision, he saw 4 beasts, and he describes 3 of them. The second vision, what does he start with? I saw in my night visions, verse 7.
Was it a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong?
Yeah, so he starts with describing the 4th beast. So like in the first vision, he describes the first 3, but in the second vision, he describes the 4th, and then he describes who?
The Ancient of Days.
The Ancient of Days, and then there's what happens between the Ancient of Days and the 4th beast?
The beast is slain.
The beast gets killed. So it's like there's the beast there. So the first vision, wow, I see these beasts rising up. This is what 3 of them looked like. Second vision, this 4th beast is nuts, you guys, crazy, unlike any of the other beasts. But there's also the Ancient of Days, and the beast is slain, and its body burned. The other beasts, while their dominion was taken away, they weren't killed like this first beast was. So that's the second vision. The next one, verse 13 and 14. I saw in the night visions. And sorry, just to pause real quick there. We will be talking about what these things mean. So like I said, the interpretation starts in verse 15. So the reason we're not looking at the interpretation of these yet is because we're going to look at that in a second when we get to the interpretation. So just right now I just want to know, like, literally, what did he see? And he describes these beasts. And so that's why we're not looking at, who is the bear, who is the lion, that kind of thing. So the third vision, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Somebody very briefly, what do we see in the third vision? It's not a trick question. You can look at the. All right, Amber, what do we see in the third vision? We just read it. You could just read it if you want.
The Ancient of Days, Sydney.
There was the Ancient of Days again, but there's another character
And the
introduced.
beast was slain.
No, that was the previous vision.
Mm.
There's no beast in this one.
I beheld them because it was the great words which the horn spoke. I beheld till the beast was slain.
That-
His body was destroyed.
That was the previous vision. This one starts in 13.
This is when the Son of Man is given dominion.
The Son of Man. There's a dude up there. There's a guy. There's a man. Like in the first, like we see beast, Ancient of Days. Ancient of Days slays the beast. And now, with the clouds, there came one like a Son of Man. And so it's like, there's the Ancient of Days is described in the second vision and his war with the beast. But the third vision, there's a guy, there's a man, there's a human being. Now, looking back at the first vision, when he describes the first beast, he says he was given a mind of a man, but he still was a beast throughout the whole vision. Like he stands up and he walks, and he's kind of. I just pictured like a cartoon, like a lion just suddenly like stands up and starts talking, like, oh, he's been given the mind of a man, but he's still a beast. Everything's a beast so far until there's the Ancient of Days, and then now, the Son of Man. There's a Son of Man who came and was presented before the Ancient of Days, and to him was given dominion. Now, like I said, we're going to be getting into the interpretation of these things in just a moment. But I wanted to read Daniel's interpretation before we start to explain, how we understand the interpretation. So, we're just going to read through 15 through the end, just to kind of hear. This is what Daniel says about the interpretation of this vision, or these visions that all comprise this dream, and then we'll go back and we're going to kind of go backwards. So we're going to look and interpret 13 and 14 first, then we're going to interpret the other two visions. So, real quick, we're going to read through 15 through the end of the chapter, and then look at specifically, this is how he understood these three visions which comprised his dream. Everybody together? I know it's kind of going fast. You good, Dan? Are you tracking? If Dan's tracking, everybody is.
I plan to catch up.
Okay. Somebody want to catch Dan up? Michelle,
Right now?
you volunteer? Real quick, one dream, three visions. First vision, I see beasts, and I'm going to describe three of them: a lion, a bear, and a leopard. Second vision, there's a fourth beast. He's more ferocious than all the rest of them. There's an Ancient of Days, and the Ancient of Days slays and kills the beast. Third vision, the Ancient of Days, and now there's a Son of Man presented before him, and dominion is given to the Son of Man. Those three are the visions that comprise his one dream.
Which one was the beast given the mind of a man?
The first, the lion. And you can also read it yourself if you want.
Yes, sir. Gosh, I'm so stupid.
So starting 7 verse 15. As for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there. Just on a pause there. Who are these that are standing there? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. We're in verse 15, Amber.
I just look different.
Yours looks different?
That's okay, keep going.
All right, so verse 16. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all of this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. So in verse 17, and he's starting to this one who is standing there is telling Daniel what the dream means. Verse 17. These 4 great beasts are 4 kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever and ever. Then I desired to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, and which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet, and about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came. And judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Thus he said, As for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on the earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey them. Here is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me, and my color changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Does anybody's Bible end with quotation marks there at the end? I see Mary nodding, I see Amber shaking her head. So I think the proper understanding of that is to close that with quotation marks, because if you go all the way back to 7 verse 1, 7 verse 2, Daniel declared, and now Daniel's talking in first person. I, Daniel, saw the such and such. That hasn't been the case through the whole book so far. If you notice, going all the way back to chapter 1, it refers to Daniel, but it's referring to him in the third person. There's a narrator talking about Daniel, just like he's talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That all changes in 8 verse 1. 8 verse 1, Daniel speaks in the first person for the rest of the book. That's another indication, I think, that 2 through 7 is kind of its own section. He wrote it in Aramaic. It's got its kind of unique message that it's giving in its audience. And then in 8 verse 1, there's a lot of prophetic stuff, weird beasts and things that are very similar to what we see in 2 and 7. But it's different because Daniel's speaking in the first person for the rest of the book. So just wanted to point that out there. Chapter 7 is kind of in first person. Daniel's talking, but it starts with the kind of third person narrator. In the first year of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, Daniel, third person, saw a dream and visions. He wrote down the dream, told the son. Daniel declared, and then it puts quotes, and it puts the whole rest of the thing in quotes. So chapter 7 is still kind of written in the third person, meaning it's a narrator talking about Daniel, as opposed to 8 through the end, where it's Daniel talking of himself in the first person. So I just wanted to point that out real quick, see if anybody else has had those quotes. So I just wanted to read that section just so we can kind of, we're like I said, we're not going to even come close to getting through all of it tonight. But that was how Daniel basically explained the dream. And he talked about the beasts. He said these are kings. And he talked about the last beast. He's like, oh, there's going to be a real bad king. And he talked about the Ancient of Days. He's going to be destroyed. The kingdom is going to be given to the saints of the Most High. So we can kind of just get a real quick overview of how Daniel understood or how Daniel, it was explained to Daniel what these dreams mean. And we're going to look at them more specifically in, a little bit tonight, but probably mostly next time. Tonight I wanted to look at the third vision, verse 13 and 14. I'm going to read it again real quick. It's just 2 verses. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples and nations and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Does anybody recognize in that section anything that was quoted in the New Testament?
Isn't this from Revelations 5?
What part?
Revelations 5?
What part is in Revelation 5? The whole thing? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying I don't know of it being that, but you could be right. We are going to actually look a good bit at Revelation 5 in a minute, but I don't see a direct quote in Revelation 5 from this section, except for with the lamb. I get, so you're just saying the way that the elders describe the lamb, to him belongs dominion and all that. Yeah, I can see. Yeah, that could be a reference there. What else? There's a very specific verse that's quoted, I think, at least in the 3 synoptic gospels. I'll give you another hint. Jesus is the one who says it.
Oh, Jesus' return when he predicts him coming back in the clouds.
And from now, are you the Christ? We adjure you, tell us. You have said so. And from now on you shall see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. You know, that's a direct...
Did you say that to Nathaniel too?
He might. He definitely says it to the...
James says no.
James says no. James is the authority. Nobody's foolish enough to argue with James about it. Maybe John, but he's not here. You will see, and he uses that phrase, the Son of Man. He uses that a lot, but he uses it there too. And he says, coming on the clouds of heaven. There's one subtle difference, though, if we look at it. The way Jesus says it, he's on earth talking to other people that are on earth. And he says, you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Where in this vision that Daniel gives, what, for lack of a better way of phrasing it, what direction is the Son of Man going? Who's he going to? Is he going to the earth to appear to people?
It sounds like he's going from earth to God.
He's going to be presented to the Ancient of Days. So he's on a cloud. He's the Son of Man on a cloud. Excuse me. But Daniel is saying, is describing him being presented to the Ancient of Days, where Jesus is telling the high priest, you're going to see him coming. So it's kind of like he's coming from the sky to the earth, where this one seems to be describing coming from the earth to the sky. And I think that's important because when we look at Acts chapter 1, you guys remember the ascension described in Acts? What do the angels tell the men of Galilee in verse 11?
I see him raising up into heaven, this same Jesus which is taken up from you into heaven shall come in like manner as you have seen him go to heaven.
The way he went is the same way he's coming back. And the way he's described in the Gospels, he goes and he's taken in a cloud. Like he disappeared. Once he's covered by the cloud, he disappears. So what we see is his ascension, visible, everybody sees him going up, and then taken by a cloud, and then it's invisible to the people on the earth. Daniel's describing the Son of Man taken before the Ancient of Days. It's like the same way he's going to come back, which is why every time his second coming is described, there's clouds. Like Paul, we who are left till his coming are not going to precede those who fall asleep, but we're going to be caught up together with him in the clouds. Like that's where he's going to be. You know, like that hymn, "Behold, he comes riding on a cloud." It's like, yeah, he's coming with the clouds. And you're going to see him coming with the clouds of heaven. So it's kind of like he's describing the being presented before the Ancient of Days, and he's describing the coming. But in both cases, he's kind of referencing the Son of Man, a human being, a flesh and bone man, traveling kind of between this dimension and that dimension. And Jesus is telling the high priest, the reason why they tear their robes is like, you're blaspheming, is because they knew exactly what he was referring to. He's like, I am that figure in heaven that Daniel talked about. And there's actually in Jewish literature before, like the intertestamental Jewish literature, debates about this section in Daniel. It's like, is the Son of Man a divine figure? And if he is, how is he a son of man? And is the Ancient of Days God? Why is all the dominion being given to the Son of Man? And there were debate. There wasn't like a unified understanding of it. There is now a unified understanding of it because they're among Jews who have rejected Christ, saying no, he's not a divine figure, because they don't want there to possibly be the Christian argument. Yeah, there's a man who is also divine. All of the authority that the Ancient of Days has is given unto this second person up there. And so, anyway, we don't need to get into the detail of that. But what the picture that Jesus was wanting to present, the picture that the angels were saying, is he was taken with the clouds. You remember what he said? He's coming with the clouds of heaven. Right now, the Daniel 7 thing is happening. He's being presented before the Ancient of Days, and all of the dominion and authority is given to him. He's going to be back in the same way. He's going to come on the clouds, and all of the authority that the Ancient of Days has is given unto him. That kind of makes sense. Like, so it's like the way that Daniel seems to describe this vision is like the first two visions are kind of like excuse me, kind of like a chronology. You've got the four beasts. He describes the three, but then the second vision is he describes the fourth, which seems to be the scariest. He's like, I'm really worried about this fourth beast. Can you tell me more about this fourth beast? He's like, yeah, let me tell you about the fourth beast. So the second vision is like, that fourth beast, he's really scary, but he's destroyed by the Ancient of Days. But it's not just the Ancient of Days. This third vision, there's actually a man. There's a man in the heavens with the Ancient of Days presented before him, and he's given all of the authority. And it's like looking back at the Old Testament, knowing what Jesus said of himself. It's like you could read the whole Old Testament and hear so many claims like, I am the Lord your God. The Lord is one. Like, there's one God. We're total monotheists here. There's no possibility of there being a second person up there. But it's like Daniel seems to see a second person, and he has like the same kind of things are said of the Ancient of Days that are said of him. And so that's why when Jesus is like claiming his deity, it's like, Son of Man, see him on the clouds of heaven. I can just see like the high priest like, man, he's got a point. Darn it. There was a Son of Man in heaven, and he was presented before the Ancient of Days, and he was given all the authority. And so that's what Jesus is referencing when he says those things about himself. We're already pretty much out of time, but I hope we can get just a little bit further. But was there any extra questions or thoughts about that third vision there of the Son of Man and the Ancient of Days?
If this is where he's about to be given all his dominion right before the millennial reign.
It's a good question. What say you guys?
Could also be right when he is risen from the dead, resurrected.
Yeah.
He says, all power and authority in heaven and earth is given unto me.
He
To
exercises.
Yep. And he, therefore, go disciple the nations. Right? Up till this point, it's like, only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? Like most of the Old Testament is written to Israel. Most of it's written in Hebrew. Most of it is just talking to God's people, the nation of Israel. And when Jesus is on earth, it's like, go tell our fellow Jews that the Messiah is here. Now that all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me, go disciple all the nations. It's like, I don't think it's a coincidence that that's in the Aramaic section of the Old Testament. It's like, all authority and dominion, right in the middle of me telling you that, there's Gentile kings that are going to receive power, but God the Most High is the one who raises them up. And their final boss, their last guy, this what is he called? It doesn't even say an animal. He's just a beast. This last beast, who's more ferocious than all the rest, he will be destroyed by the Ancient of Days, and this man will be given all authority and power. It's like when the Lord's telling his disciples that, like, all the nations are given unto me, all the authority, not just the nation of Israel. But to answer your question, when does this actually happen? As far as like when does he receive the authority? I think officially he receives it upon his resurrection, but something happened at his ascension too. Like when he's about to go up, he's like, "Wait in Jerusalem till you be clothed with power from on high." And when he's talking of the Holy Spirit, he says, "For the Spirit was not yet, for the Son of Man had not yet been glorified." So something about him, this Son of Man, resurrected, being presented before the Ancient of Days, makes the Holy Spirit come in a more powerful way, that they're able to now fulfill the commission that he gave him before that. So when did he receive the authority? Yes, at his resurrection. Yes, at his ascension. But also, yes, at his second coming. Like he kind of comes and he claims the ground, like in the most tangible sense, I think, at his second coming. And the battle that we see described in Daniel chapter 7 between the Ancient of Days and this final giant beast sounds a lot like Revelation 19, when the Lamb comes and slays the beast out of the sea and casts him into the lake of fire together with the false prophet. I think that's Revelation 19 and 20 are describing the same thing that Daniel 7 is describing. The final boss of the Gentile world leaders is finally destroyed by the Lamb, by the Ancient of Days, by the Son of Man who receives all of that authority. So
verses 13 and 14 probably happened on the day of Pentecost, if we're trying to pinpoint a day.
How time works in
Right.
the supernatural heavenlies, maybe it's like forever present happening.
Right.
But yes, like that's kind of what I'm saying, is like he comes and is presented before the Ancient of Days, and he's going to come back again to claim the earth, which he was all the authority he was given.
Is this the first time in the Bible that God is referred to as the Ancient of Days?
The only time. The book of Daniel is the only place.
Not even in Revelation.
Yeah. So we do a little word study on Ancient of Days. Daniel's the only place that he's
I
called.
wonder where that kind of comes from. I mean, like God talks about you should call me this or that, right? Like to the Israelites, Jehovah and Jireh and all those, Jehovah Rapha and the healer, and but he never says anything about calling me the Ancient of Days. He's just referred to here as that, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Daniel also calls him God the Most High a lot. So it's kind of like, and I think this will be the last thing we talk about because we're just about out of time, but I did want to just touch on, and it relates to that question, Dave. Who are these ones that are seated around him? Like one of those who stood there, all he mentions is the Ancient of Days, but apparently there's others that are there. And if you notice in verse 9, there's the seat that the Ancient of Days sits on, singular, but there's thrones, plural. Thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat.
In my version, it says the thrones were cast down, so it seemed, whenever I read it, it seemed like the thrones of the Gentile kingdoms.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
But I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not enough of an Aramaic person to tell why one translation would say placed, but another would say cast down. In my interpretation of it, however, and again, I could look at the Septuagint, I suppose, but the point that he's making is that, let me just real quick, I'm going to read a passage out of Psalms. Psalm 82. Again, if you have the King James, it's going to phrase it a little bit differently.
Just
But
a real quick note on what James said. I've
Mhm.
looked at a bunch of different other translations. ESV, Amplified Classic, Darby, Holman Christian Standard, NKJV, NLT, NASB 2020 all say something along the lines of set up or place.
right, and that NKJV has it that way would tell me that it's the manuscript would probably agree with that because they're based on the same manuscript as the King James. But Psalm 82, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men, you shall die and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. We do not have enough time tonight to get into a full explanation of that passage, but what you see is Elohim, God, sitting in a council of the gods. And different translations will translate it differently, but there's no getting away with the Hebrew from the Hebrew. That's what it says. There are Elohim around him. And he, Elohim, is sitting among them. God is sitting among the gods. And he says, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, because you're not giving justice to the fatherless and the weak, you're showing partiality to the wicked, you're going to fall like any prince. You're going to die like men. When we get to the book of Daniel, he uses a phrase in Daniel chapter 4, verse 13. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in my bed, behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. And he proclaimed aloud, and go down to verse 17. He talks about the judgment that's going to come upon Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 17. This sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men. Again, Daniel is unique. No other Old Testament book uses that phrase, that word, the watchers. It's all over the intertestamental books. It's called the pseudepigrapha, which is all these Jewish books that put names from Old Testament figures. The most famous one is the book of Enoch, which is an intertestamental book that it's written from the perspective of Enoch from Genesis. Enoch didn't write it. It's 1,000 years after Enoch. But it's kind of written from his perspective, and it uses that phrase again and again and again. And the watchers in the book of Enoch were the angels, the sons of God, in Genesis chapter 6. The Daniel says there's watchers that make a decree, and their decree is that the Most High rules among men, so that's why we're going to judge him. So really what Daniel's picturing, which is similar to what we see in Psalm 82, God sits in a council, just like what any other king would do. He has his entourage. He has his people. Like Solomon had his elders that were around him. And when his son, was it Jeroboam or Rehoboam? When his son Rehoboam is taking over, they're like, listen to the elders who advised your dad. They're giving good advice. No, I'm not going to listen to them. I'm going to listen to my homies that are young. And they're telling me to be harsh with people. It's like, that was just a picture. Like the king is going to have his people that are around him. And the Old Testament describes that, God kind of in that position. And so when Daniel is seeing the Ancient of Days, it's not throne, it's thrones, plural, are set up. And so, just like in chapter 4, one of the watchers comes and says, hey, here's what's going on. The decree of the watchers is this. So in this chapter, just one of them who's up there with him, one of those standing there. He didn't mention him, but if there's a king seated, he's going to have his entourage. In the New Testament, they pretty much use the word angel, or Greek angelos, to refer to all of. They don't use the word watcher. They don't use the word sons of God. They don't use the word Elohim or gods. They just say angel for all of them. Sometimes they'll say principalities, powers, but they're basically when we say the angelic hosts, these created beings that are up there with God. Some of them rebelled and are judged, like Psalm 82 says. Some of them are loyal and sit in council with Jehovah. And they have decrees. And the reason why I wanted to get into all this is when we get to this interpretation is being given to Daniel, seemingly by one of these guys. He's not called an angel. He's not called a son of God. He's not called an Elohim. He's not even called a watcher, like he says earlier in chapter 4. But it's one of those who's there is describing to him what's going to happen. And when you look in verse, really several places in his interpretation, verse 27, the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the Most High himself. Is that what it says, Dan?
Under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High.
And their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the Most High by himself. It's not the Ancient of Days by himself. It's always him with his entourage, with his people. And in the Old Testament, some of them rebelled and they're judged. When we skip to Revelation chapter 5, which Ruth was prescient enough to notice was referenced in this chapter.
Good, I just had it in my Bible.
Oh, really? He's not called the Ancient of Days. He's not called the Most High, but there was one on a throne. And around him were 24 elders. Those 24 elders cast their crowns before whom? You guys remember? Before the Lamb. When we see in the New Testament, the way that, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul says, I can't believe you Corinthians are not willing to judge this dispute. You're going before unrighteous civil government. Don't you know, finish it for us, James, that you shall judge angels. Don't you know that? Don't you recognize that this heavenly entourage that's around the Most High is giving all authority to this Son of Man. And the 24 elders that sit around his throne are going to cast those crowns before the Son of Man. And he's going to reign with his companions. He's going to reign with the saints of the Most High. And the position that the saints will have when the Son of Man comes to the earth is actually going to replace that divine council. Perhaps replace, but perhaps be added in addition to it. But from my understanding, it's like he was made as a man a little lower than the angels. He says in Hebrews and referencing Psalms. That word in the Old Testament, the Septuagint says angels. The Hebrew says a little lower than the sons of God. The same way is used in Genesis 6. So it's like there's the sons of God in the heavens. New Testament calls them angels. That to take the form of a man is to become lower than. But once the Son of Man is exalted and all authority is given to him, those angels hand the authority over to men. It's like I just thought that was an important piece to see, because you won't see it just in Daniel unless you see it together with Daniel, with the way that the apostles refer, like Paul refers to the ruling of angels. Until you see, like in Hebrews, it's not to angels that he's subjected the age to come, but who is man that you're mindful of him? It's like this switch between who is the higher and who is the lower takes place when the Lord comes back. The crowns, if I'm understanding correctly, the crowns that the elders cast down are given to the saints to rule together with him in the age to come. But what we're seeing here in this scene, Daniel's like, there's the Ancient of Days, Son of Man being brought before him. Hey, psst, you, one of the other guys up there, tell me, what's going on? Who's this beast? What? It's like, I'll tell you what's going on. And it's one of those watchers, sons of God, angels, members of the divine council who gives the interpretation to Daniel. But
When you were first asking who it was, my thought was like, is it like the cherubim or the seraphim? Because like they're usually like the ones that surround God, right? Like you even had the altar, right, which was surrounded also by the cherubim and the seraphim. So, and they would also be considered angels as well, right?
they're never called angels in the Old Testament, but the New Testament uses angel as kind of a catch-all for all of the heavenly beings. The word angel is in the Old Testament, but it's used more specifically for what angelos means, messenger. You know, so if somebody comes from heaven, a spirit being with a message, he's called an angel. But in the New Testament, he'll say, like, it's not to angels that he subjected the world to come. Or, you know, it's usually, it'll use angel not just to refer to, oh, Gabriel's here with a message, but kind of all of the heavenly, which would include the cherubim and the seraphim. Like, the Old Testament kind of just calls them by different names. Job calls them the sons of God. Genesis 6 calls them the sons of God.
Yeah, because we just read Genesis 6, and it talks about how the sons of God came down to earth, right? Because
Yeah.
they were beautiful women.
Right.
Are those the same as the, what were they called, the Nephilim or something?
The Nephilim were their offspring.
Oh, that was their offspring.
Yeah.
Which do we know what that is? Just as a side note.
We can get into more detail on that after we're done if you want. We're way over time. But
Rachel wants to know that, so
Yeah.
I'm just asking.
we'll talk about the Nephilim after we're done here. But this dude who's up there, one of the watchers, one of the divine entourage, tells Daniel and explains to him who these beasts are in a little bit more of a specific way. We'll pick up on that when we come back next time. But just so we're all kind of together, he sees the vision, or he has this dream. It consists of these visions. The visions are there's 4 beasts that come up out of the sea. His most concern is about this last one. It's by far the scariest. It battles with the Ancient of Days and is slain. The whole authority is given unto the Son of Man. Now, one of those who's standing there is explaining. These 3 are kings who are going to rise up. And we're going to look at the specifics next time. Anything else before we close out? Somebody mind closing us in prayer and thanking the Lord for our time?
Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for time to just learn together and to hopefully, Lord, be able to walk closer with you through this understanding and knowledge of what you have in your word. I pray that you would reveal wondrous things out of your scripture to us, Lord, and that we would open our hearts, our minds, that we would be enlightened and encouraged and edified and convicted, however you would lead us. And so we just thank you for it. We thank you for this time, what you've shown us, and we pray that we would be changed because of it, and pray that we would go forth and glorify and honor you.